Good evening, everyone, and may I just add my welcome to you all as well. As Brandon said, this is our 4th annual summer school lecture, and it was very important to us that the work of the Commission be represented, and we were delighted when Kathryn, who is relatively recently in post, was able to take up our invitation and come and do this. I think the fact that we have so many people from the Northwest joining us for this lecture is testament to the importance of the work, and many people joining our summer school participants are working in this area, and I think they'll not only be interested in listening to hear what you and your colleagues have to say, but also perhaps to some questions and discussion later on. So Kathryn OBE was appointed as the new Commissioner for Victims and Survivors for Northern Ireland in September 2012. Prior to taking up her post with the Commission, Kathryn was the Chief Executive of Voice UK, which is a national learning disability charity promoting justice and well-being for vulnerable victims, as well as supporting their parents and carers. And again, many people in the audience would probably be interested to hearing you talking about your former roles as well. Kathryn was also the Principal Inspector for Milton Keynes Council and Head of Inspection for the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham and Barking and Dagenham, responsible for the regulation of residential, nursing and day care. She also worked as an independent inspector for 8 local authorities across the UK, and Kathryn was awarded her OBE in 2007 for her services to people with learning disabilities, and was made a Chartered Director by the Institute of Directors in 2008 and a Fellow of the Institute of Directors in 2009. In her presentation tonight, Kathryn will be supported by 2 members of the Victims Forum, Leslie Carroll and Alan Bracknell. Alan's actually participating as a summer school participant, so we're delighted to hear a bit from him, and also to welcome Leslie as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It always makes me feel a bit showy-offy when people go through what I used to do and the qualifications. I never did get cycling proficiency, but it doesn't seem to have held me back. Thank you again for your invitation to be here today and the invitation to talk to you about the work of the Commission and the Forum. The last time I was here in this building, Brandon was introducing and then interviewing the Dalai Lama. One of my colleagues at the Commission said that for Brandon then this evening was the motoring equivalent of going from an Audi to a Vauxhall Astra. I encourage openness and honesty amongst my colleagues, but I think there are limits. I also know that some of you might have heard President Obama speak on Monday morning at the Waterfront Hall, and are probably now feeling very shortchanged at having to listen to me. I was there on Monday morning, and although the leader of the free world was good, for my money, he wasn't quite as good as the 16-year-old girl from Belfast. But more of Hannah Nelson and her very still, quiet voice later. I've spoken to some past participants of the International Summer School and heard directly from them of the wonderful opportunity it presents to meet and discuss issues of conflict resolution and peace building with others from all over the world. I read in your literature that the summer school presents a unique opportunity to create links between theory, practice and policy, and I also hope to address these issues throughout my presentation tonight. Thankfully, as Gillian said, I'm not here on my own. I'm very grateful to Alan and to Leslie, members of our forum, for giving up their time to be with us this evening. And some of you will already know Alan from your studies this week because he's a participant on the school. And Leslie and Alan are going to introduce themselves to you in a short while. And I'm also particularly glad that they're here with me for moral support, because it's quite a lonely place standing here. It's okay, I'm going for the sympathy vote now. But please can I also thank those in the audience who I asked to be here for coming along. I'm sincerely grateful to you for your continued support and continue to be inspired by you. You know who you are. Well, I was appointed to the post of Victims Commissioner last September and have just come through my first 10 months in post. Now, before I came here, naturally I did a lot of reading and a lot of researching, And I read a piece by the former Victims Commissioner, Sir Kenneth Bloomfield, who described this role as a painful privilege. I had no idea what that meant then, but I'm acutely conscious of what that means now. We're going to come back to Sir Kenneth later too. As the Commissioner for Victims and Survivors in Northern Ireland, I believe passionately in the work of the Commission and the rights of all victims and survivors to be heard, to be respected, and to have access to services that are the very best they can be. Our vision at the Commission is to improve the lives of all victims and survivors. What does a Victims Commissioner do all day? Well, my role is defined in statute, but is essentially to promote the interests of victims and survivors. Simple. Except, of course, it's not. In Northern Ireland, as I'm sure many of you here tonight know, there are a lot of things that are contested. The definition of a victim is one of them. The law, as it stands, is clear and states that a victim is someone who's been injured, someone who's been bereaved, or someone caring for someone who's been injured. The injury can be physical or it can be psychological. It would seem, on the face of it, to be straightforward. However, there are many in Northern Ireland who believe that there should be a hierarchy of victims, that there are innocent victims and there are victim makers, and these victim makers should not be included in the definition of victim. People believe that those who set out to kill and maim with guns or bombs and are killed themselves or injured as a result of their actions should be afforded no assistance whatsoever. Other commentators have said that this approach doesn't appear to allow for those who were killed as a result of state collusion, those who were killed or injured, for example, in the events of Bloody Sunday. Despite apologies from the Westminster government, there seems to be little acknowledgement that these families and their loved ones were completely innocent. Positions become entrenched and no one hears the other opinion, as their opinion is the right one. It's as though by the very act of listening honestly and carefully, there could be a contamination. Maybe then, what is really being talked about, it's been suggested, is a hierarchy of blame. And Leslie and Alan are going to revisit these things later. One thing I am certain of here is that there must never be a hierarchy of pain. It's often said that the tears of the victim's mother are the same colour as those of the mother of the man who set the bomb. No one wins, everybody hurts. Let me give you a bit more information about the Commission, and here's the science bit. The Commission for Victims and Survivors is a non-departmental public body of the Office of the First and Deputy First Minister. It was recommended in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, formulated in legislation in 2006, established by ministers in 2008, given a policy framework in 2009, and now has a number of statutory duties. Recently, we've been planning for our next 3 years, and our focus will be on raising awareness of the impact of the past on all victims and survivors, empowering and supporting victims and survivors to make a contribution to a better and shared future, raising awareness of victims and survivors' issues. Practically and on day-to-day issues, the Commission makes a difference by advising government, working in partnership with the Victims and Survivors Service, carrying out research to inform advice, and facilitating the work of the forum. When we think of the conflict in Northern Ireland, we must consider whether or not this was a conflict. And this is a debate that rages in discussions that I have out and about with groups of people that I meet. To digress, conflict is a contested word, with some feeling this word gives credence to a politicisation of a terrorist campaign and prefer to use the word troubles, while others feel the conflict more accurately describes the bloodshed and the concerted attempts to kill and to maim. Events here had a high intensity in terms of the number of people killed and injured. It sustained over 30 years. It happened in a society with a relatively small population of just over 1 million people. We also have to remember levels of inter and intra-community violence and the fact that today people live close by to those who those they know killed their relatives, tried to kill them, shoot them, blow them up, or deliberately injured them during the Troubles. Specifically, in terms of numbers, depending which research you read, about 3,700 people were killed and 107,000 were estimated to have suffered injury. Approximately 30% of the population of Northern Ireland consider themselves to have been directly affected. 10% have been bereaved as a consequence. The Commission estimates that the number of victims and survivors equates to approximately 500,000 people. Many people tell me that it would have been hard not to have been affected here. Recently, I was parking my car when I was approached by a security guard. He was a former RUC officer, clearly affected by what he'd seen, what he'd heard, and what he'd experienced. At the end of a lengthy and clearly upsetting description of his life, he said to me, "We're all victims here, love." Research carried out by the Commission in partnership with this university in 2011 found that 4 out of 10 people here had suffered a traumatic event related to the Troubles, and that Northern Ireland has one of the highest recorded rates of post-traumatic stress disorder anywhere in the world. Let me say that again. Northern Ireland has one of the highest recorded rates of post-traumatic stress disorder anywhere in the world. I find that quite shocking. Dr. Ferry said in the research that it was striking that Northern Ireland has such high levels of PTSD, even compared to other areas of conflict. And she says again, as I suggested earlier, that this is linked to the many years the conflict took place and to the inter and intra-community nature of the violence. Such chronic mental health distress at almost epidemic levels impacts on the physical health, emotional well-being, on families, communities, and on your ability to work. Within this context then, my priority over the last 10 months has been getting to meet as many victims and survivors as possible. I think it's important for me to hear their story, to listen to their difficulties, identify issues that they want to see solved. Indeed, over the past 10 months I've been carrying out an extensive programme of engagement with individuals, families, groups and organisations, and look forward to continuing with this important work. I'm also working very closely with the Forum for Victims and Survivors. The Forum is the place set out in legislation for consultation and discussion on key issues. Members of the Forum bring their very important lived experience to the Commission. Their views and experiences have proved invaluable. Lived experience brings integrity, and together the Commission and the Forum are building credibility. The Forum has 26 members, 23 meet the definition of a victim, 3 members are associate members, and it's important for me to just take a minute to reinforce the contribution that's made by our Forum members as volunteers who meet once a month, if not more frequently, as a minimum to inform the work of the Commission. The work of the Forum underpins the work of the Commission, and the Forum has become a resource for the Commission to discuss and identify live issues across 3 working groups, namely dealing with the past, services, and building for the future. The Forum has engaged with a range of academics and other agencies and other organisations. And indeed tomorrow morning the Forum will get the opportunity to present and discuss their work with the First and Deputy First Minister at Stormont. And we're very much looking forward, albeit slightly nervously, to the opportunity to present to them the work of the Forum. What does all this mean for people? Some people are interested in the politics of here. Others are interested in the economics of here. I'm interested in what it means for people. How do I, as a single commissioner, tread a course through this diversity of opinion and these very different views and promote the interests of all victims and survivors? It's not easy. I think that phrase for all students of international culture and linguistics is an example of classic English understatement. It's not easy. One of the biggest challenges, if not the biggest challenge I constantly hear about, is how we deal with the past. No surprise then that dealing with the past should be one of the working groups of the forum. I want you to come with me to explore the past through the eyes of victims and survivors. But let me warn you, this is a very difficult place to get to, and it's an even more difficult place to leave. These inherent difficulties are possibly why people have said victims should move on. Put it all behind you. Sure, they'll all be dead soon and we can forget about it. My response to that is very straightforward. We must never forget. We must never try to put it all behind us. For the many hundreds, and it is hundreds now, of victims and survivors I've spoken to, this is so offensive and so insulting. For them, the past is something that they deal with every day. The past is now, and here's why. If you go out on a Sunday morning with your dad, you come home but your dad and 11 others don't. You want justice for that. 25 years later, with no justice, you're still dealing with the past. The injuries you sustained, the chronic health problems you now experience, mean you're dealing with the past every day. The past is your present and will profoundly affect your future too. If you're buried under a mountain of rubble and left permanently disabled, your marriage in shreds, your husband's physical and mental health destroyed, you want justice for that. The injuries you sustained and the chronic health problems you now experience mean you're dealing with the past every day. What is the past for others is your present and will profoundly affect your future too. What if your child is shot by a stray bullet and you spend night after night sleeping on their gravestone because you can't bear for them to be alone and frightened? You want justice for that. Every birthday, every Christmas, every holiday, every child you see in a duffel coat, every child you hear crying means you deal with your past every day. Every part of your present is profoundly affected, and your future becomes something that you just can't think about, because to do so without your little one is unbearable and almost a betrayal of him. What if, as a result of just doing your job in the RUC, you're left with a broken body and a broken mind, trying to explain to your children why your legs don't work, and trying to keep them from the rage that you have to let out somewhere, that no one has been brought to justice for what happened to you the night your mate died when the bomb went off in the car you were both in? The past changes you. I watched a short while ago, through my fingers I guess like many other people, a television documentary made here called 14 Days. I'm sure some of you watched it too. If you didn't see it, Google it, but be warned, it's grim. I wondered what it would be like to be the reporter, the photographer, who records the violence and the bloody, battered, dying aftermath of such violence. That has to change you. The picture you take, the report you write, isn't just on your film or your memory card or your notepad. It's burned on your brain's hard drive, and it will never be deleted, no matter what button you press. A proud sister wrote to me with this about her brother, a former prisoner. She said, My brother was a victim of the war. My brother would never have told anyone of his torment. He felt it would have been touting. That's laughable. His children lost a father, we lost a brother, and my parents lost their son, and that was before he died. The saddest part, no one cares. But I care, and that's why I'm telling you this. So please, Kathryn, help all those who need it. I don't like the word victim, and I know that's a debate in itself, but I told you this for my brother, because he never got to tell anyone. I love my brother, and I thought I would tell his story for him. Now, often in lectures like this, the speaker quotes from the work of others. It's often the case, in my experience anyway, that the person being quoted is far more eloquent than the speaker themselves, and I'm no exception. Required reading for anyone interested in this topic is Priscilla Hayner's book, Unspeakable Truths. It's a very measured, very wise consideration of how societies in a post-transitional justice phase coming out of conflict deal with the past. She compares the approaches of many countries and highlights common themes. Earlier in this presentation, I spoke about victims wanting justice, and Priscilla identifies a desire for justice through the courts as being a prominent demand. She goes on to say that it's a prominent demand, but it's one of the most difficult to achieve, highlighting the fact that trials are few in number and sometimes fail to convict even those everyone knows are guilty. Now, since I've been here, I've been learning some of the language of here too. And I've learned the phrase, even the dogs in the street know. And this is usually followed by X or Y did it. Now, I have limited experience of canine justice, and perhaps the dogs here are better arbiters of previous bad character. But personally, I would rather rely on what substantiated evidential approaches can tell us than what the dogs in the street know, or don't know. Bringing people to justice through the courts is very difficult in such societies, and here is no exception. With unique circumstances, multiple violent deaths, with inexperienced police officers running complex investigations, lack of forensics, lack of records, or where such things existed, they were stored badly, got lost, destroyed, or were blown up. We can't apply contemporary standards of investigation retrospectively. Whatever happens now on CSI Miami or on Silent Witness really wasn't happening on the Antrim Road or in Fermanagh in the 1970s and 80s. So if we can't bring people to justice, what can we do? Is a truth commission the answer? And what do we mean by truth? Not far from where my family live in England, there was a terrible event in 1999. 96 people lost their lives in Hillsborough Football Stadium before a football match. For 23 years, the families campaigned for the truth. There were inquiries, there were inquests. The families refused to accept these as the truth until last year, when the Hillsborough Independent Panel delivered them the truth. But it was the truth they already knew. That their loved ones were innocent, that the police had lied and covered up, that a new version of the truth had been created to protect all those who had been implicated. Heads rolled, or were rather allowed to retire early, but families had their truth. They had, as Hayner recognises in her book, official recognition now, rather than official denial. The process reclaimed history and opened it up for review. A light was shone into some very dark corners. There have been similar experiences in relation to specific events here, although, like here for the Hillsborough families, many of those left behind now want other things. We have our truth, now we want justice. Even someone as eminent as Priscilla Hayner quotes other people. She illustrates her point on this by quoting Michael Ignatieff and saying, "The past is an argument, and the function of a truth commission is like the function of an honest historian. It is to simply purify the argument into a range of permissible lies." I've read that 50% of people in Northern Ireland think a Truth Commission would be really useful, but that in the same survey, 75% of people thought nobody would tell the truth. So is a Truth Commission what's needed here? Perhaps truth isn't the right word. Perhaps truth is too loaded, too emotional, too subjective. Whose truth are we talking about? Each person sees the past through their eyes. It's filtered by their experience. And we look at it through a kaleidoscope. And Leslie's going to talk more about this later, referring to a lens of innocence or guilt. A Truth Commission is a big picture societal response that doesn't really help you if your legs were blown off and you're worried that you won't have enough money to buy oil to heat your home if your benefits change. Maybe what we need is information or explanation or acknowledgement. In this way, those who have been so badly affected can be supported to begin to heal the wounds they have, to live, albeit as different people, but with an understanding that society accepts the terrible wrongs that happen and why they must never happen again. A theme which we're going to hear when we hear directly from members of the Victims Forum, and perhaps something that you might want to think about during your deliberations. And so, it is with great pleasure that I now pass you across to the Reverend Dr. Leslie Carroll and Alan Brecknell, two members of the Forum's Dealing with the Past working group, who will highlight the work which they've undertaken in the past year and share with you some of their conclusions. And then it'll come back to me for a summing up.
First of all, on behalf of Alan and myself, can I say thank you to Kathryn for allowing us as forum members, or forcing us as forum members, to be here tonight and to share with you some of the things that we have been thinking about. And I suppose what we're doing is really bringing those broad themes right home to what's happening here in Northern Ireland. So I am an associate member of the forum, one of the 3 associate members. We don't meet the definition of a victim, but we come in to give our time and to listen and to do what we can from the broad experience that we have as well. As Kathryn alluded to there, in my paid life, I'm a Presbyterian minister. I work in North Belfast, which is one of the areas that has been most impacted by the years of trouble and unrest. I'm originally from County Tyrone, from Quill Island, an area which we prods called Apache country. And in a previous life, I was a member of the consultative group on dealing with the past, which was government appointed in 2007 and reported in 2009, some ways of dealing with the past which haven't happened. So now I am in the working group on the Victims Forum, looking at some ways to deal with Northern Ireland's past. I want to look, first of all, as Kathryn said, at innocence and guilt as a lens to help us understand and demonstrate the diversity of opinions that exist within the forum. Now, Kathryn has already spoken to this in a broad sense, so let me try to put it into a nutshell for you by demonstrating what the 2 ends of the spectrum might be, and remember that there is everything else in between. So at one end of the spectrum around innocence and guilt, there are those who want to establish innocence. And they believe firmly that it is possible to establish who the innocent were. And I suppose in Northern Ireland we do have to acknowledge that innocence is hard to come by. It's not something that we talk about very often, and it's not easy to talk about. And when we begin to talk about innocence, what it actually does is pitch itself into the political arrangements, the political discussions, in a way that really disrupts and destabilizes them. It tampers, and the notion of innocence tampers with our emotions, threatens us and makes us feel uncomfortable at times. But there are those who believe it is possible to establish it. At that end of the spectrum, people tend to want detailed individual information. They're looking for people to maybe hold up their hands and tell what has been done. It doesn't matter really to those at the sharp end of the spectrum that sentences might only be 2 years long following on the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And across the board, while there are people who believe in innocence, there are these other folks at the end of the spectrum who believe the past needs to be dealt with by establishing who is innocent and who is guilty. So that's one end of the spectrum. You've got everything in between. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have those who believe that what happened here over the years was that society broke down systemically and terrible things happened. And as the breakdown was systemic, there are therefore no clean hands. So everyone is guilty. So establishing innocence is not part of the picture at that end of the spectrum. It's not about innocence and guilt. It's about collapse. Prosecutions are likely to be of very little consequence or interest to people at that end of the spectrum. They believe that the past needs to be dealt with in a way that enables people to move on, and that's unlikely to include prosecutions. So innocence and guilt, given that diverse group of people, we had to develop a framework for our conversations, because we have people from every part of that spectrum in the membership of the forum, and we have people from every part of that spectrum within our working group. In order to develop a framework, we had to find some common ground, and our common ground is found in the shared suffering that people have and in the desire that it should not happen again. It should never happen again is our banner underpinning value, if you like. It is a contested notion, so we just call it it. I'll say a little bit more about that later. Suffering, however, is not contested. What the forum know for sure is that people should not have to live in terror. They should not have to live in fear. They should not have to live with limited ambitions. They should not have to live with injury or loss as they have done in the past. Something went wrong. How society was constructed back then meant that things weren't the way they should be. So how society is now and how society is constructed now is crucial, and the Victims and Survivors Forum and our working group want to contribute to that, and it is crucial that they do in order that it should never happen again. It should never happen again means that when we come to making decisions or recommendations or having conversations, we measure what we do against this idea. Does what I want, does what we want mean that this might never happen again, or will it in fact contribute to it happening again? We also had to find a way to come to this as a whole group, not just in terms of the commonality of our suffering, but in a way that respected each other. So I put this in at this stage because it's important. So trust and confidence. People say trust and confidence in a group is going to matter. That's, however, not an easy place to start when you're within such a diverse group. So we started by beginning to make ourselves accountable to each other. So we say to ourselves at times, if I push for what I want, how is that going to affect the person at the other side of the table? How will they go home to their wife or their husband? How will they go home to their family, their community, or their victims and survivors group? How will that be for them? And in that way we begin to make ourselves accountable to each other. And alongside all of that, then we developed a series of values around which we do our work. They seem simple as I read them, but there's nothing simple about them. So the first value to which we believe people who are dealing with the past or talking about dealing with the past should sign up to is the notion that violence is futile. It got us nowhere. It got us to where we are today with all the suffering that involves. Violence is futile. The rule of law is to be respected as a basis for moving forward. I could take each of these and sort of unpack them for you, the way they impact on different groups in the community, but I'm not going to do that. So let me just use this one as a way of showing you how each of these can be worked through. So the rule of law, that sounds sensible in any ordinary organised society. We should all respect the rule of law. However, if you were the victim of terrorism, if you believe that a campaign of war was waged against you as a terrorist campaign, then it is hard to look people on that side, if you like, in the eye and believe that they're actually signing up to this. The rule of law is respected as a basis for moving forward. And if you are on the side that is being accused of being part of a terrorist campaign, then it is hard to respect the rule of law, especially if the security services in your mind are corrupt or have been corrupt in the past. So none of these values is easy. Generosity is called for, generosity to each other in the victims and survivors sector and across society. And that generosity is about learning to hear things that other people are saying to us. It's about allowing those other things to be said. Victims and survivors should be considered part of the whole community and integrated into it rather than tolerated or marginalised. Victims and survivors don't want to be set to the side. They don't want their experience to be wasted. They want to play their full part in moving this debate about dealing with the past forward. Individual, local and sectional experiences of victims should be respected. In other words, if you talk to and listen to victims and survivors, you hear individual stories, they're all different. But you also begin to get a sense that if you lived in this part of Northern Ireland, your story will be different than if you lived in this part of Northern Ireland. So experience individually is important. Geography is also important, and all of that needs to be respected within the diversity of narratives, the diversity of stories that exist. Strong political leadership and decision making, not posturing. Let's go for good democracy. The outstanding issues with regard to the past must be addressed, and one feels like putting in capital letters bold with 3 exclamation marks afterwards, now. All parties engaged in developing a better future should come to their task with humility, respect for the dignity of others, tolerance and a desire to make and embed peace. So we're trying to adopt all these values into our debate and encouraging others to do so also. Alan's going to come in a minute and talk about the areas of agreement that we have reached as a working group and the things that we still have more work to do on. But just let me, before he does, go back to the it. So the it is really the narratives of the past that exist for us. The multi-layered, multiple narratives of the past, they are our backdrop to dealing with the past. And they inform every individual and every group's view of what it means to deal with the past. There are in fact so many narratives, and they are so various, that trying to negotiate our way through to a common narrative at this point in time is, we believe, impossible and certainly not advisable. So if we're unable to share a common understanding of what it was, then what are we to do? So we on the forum are struggling to understand each other as individuals, and we're succeeding as stories resonate each with the other. It is the individual stories that resonate, and they provide a view of things, something new becoming possible. So we've begun to speak of and think about a composite narrative as a way forward rather than a common narrative. By a composite narrative, what we mean is gathering together all of the narratives. And when they are all gathered together, by whom we are not yet sure, we will have more work to do. But when all these narratives are gathered together, no one will adjudicate between them. So they will be an unadjudicated bunch of narratives. Nobody will say this one, well, there's more truth in that one than the other. People will, obviously, as they hear or read them or however that might be. But there is nobody going to come in and say this narrative's better than another. What's really crucial in this composite narrative model is that hearing the diversity is possible. We believe this would be a good beginning. At a time before there was a wee fallout, we talked about this possibly happening at the Maze Long Cache site. That's since become contested, so we don't have any suggestions right now where that might be stored, but we are talking about a composite narrative. We're committed to the debate, we're committed to hearing each other, and we're committed to moving the dealing with the past process on step by step. We're also committed to creating new space for people to move into so that future generations can deal with what we cannot deal with right now. And in dealing with those things in the future, then it ever happening again will be resisted. Composite narrative is a beginning to that process. And we also believe that hearing each other develops resilience and the potential for positive relationships so that it will never happen again.
Good evening. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Kathryn. I forgot whenever Leslie started there that we're all supposed to introduce ourselves and say a wee bit about ourselves, and I always find this quite difficult. I don't have a long list of things like Kathryn has.
Did you get psychiatric proficiency, I think?
No.
That's your self-esteem.
I'm going places then. No, as I say, anyway, I'm Alan Bracknell. I am a member of the Victims Forum. I do, in theory, not in theory, I do meet the definition of a victim as it's laid out. I don't like the word victim. I personally don't like the word survivor either, so I don't know how I'm supposed to describe myself. But anyway, I have an experience of the Troubles, or the conflict, whichever term we like to use. My father was killed in December 1975 when I was 7 years old. So that's where I come to this from, I suppose. That's how I've ended up in this field, in this line of work. Also, it was interesting, Leslie said there that she comes from an area that her community calls Apache country. I now live in, and did at the time my father was killed, live in an area that others call bandit country. Anyway, to move on, I think that's the introductions done. I've been asked to talk here about the areas of agreement and disagreement within the dealing with the past subgroup. I'm going to outline here the areas of agreement first, and when I come to the areas of disagreement, what we're basically saying is we can't agree on these areas at the minute. We appreciate there is more work to be done, and that's what we intend to do in the near future. But I think it is important to say at this stage that for such a diverse group, the members of the forum, to be able to have the difficult conversations that we have had over this last 12 months and agree on certain areas is in itself a major step forward for Northern Ireland and for victims and survivors. I think we need to bear that in mind as we go through this. People may look at this and say, you're being very negative here, you don't agree on this, you don't agree on that. I think it's very important to point out that we as a group have only been together for 12 months. There's people who have tried to work this out for this last 14, 15 years, and they aren't getting any further either. So I think that's the context that I will continue on here now. Pointing at the wrong thing. The first thing that we have agreed on is that there should be no drawing a line under the past. Victims cannot be silenced or marginalised. We had long discussions about this. It was actually talked about in the summer school today as, is it an option? I think from within our victims forum, we are basically saying no, it's not an option. Some people have said it's the ultimate amnesty, and it's the ultimate amnesty to everyone, because no one's accountable at the end of the day. We've also agreed that what should be done, what can be done, should be done. If left undone, it has the possibility of repeating itself. Branton this morning in his lecture was a bit unequivocal whether that's actually true or not, but I personally believe it, and I think the members of the Victims Forum actually believe it, that if we don't address this issue, our history tells us that it does keep coming back. It does keep coming back. Other areas of agreement are that there needs to be a process. We're not sure yet what that process is, but there needs to be a process. At the minute, we have numerous areas of trying to deal with the past. The Historical Inquiries Team, the Police Ombudsman's Office, inquests, inquiries. Lots of people will say that in their own ways they contribute, but it's not a holistic approach. It's not an overarching approach. It's everything, it's itty, it's bitty. There's a bit taken from here and a bit from there, and there's nothing joined up. And therefore, that's why we say that there needs to be some sort of a process. It needs to be an effective process. Victims need to be at the core of the process, but they're not the one and only thing. Society needs to be involved in it as well. We also say that the political nettle needs to be grasped, and as Leslie said, it needs to be grasped now. It's no good saying we'll do it in 5 years' time, or we'll do it whenever it's easier to deal with. It can't always be left in the hard to do, difficult to do box up in Stormont. We also believe that you have to engage all of those who are involved in the violence and the conflict. It has to be transparent, professional, to international standards, and accountable. Recognition and acknowledgement. Recognition for all victims. Victims in the UK, the Republic of Ireland, and elsewhere. I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that people were affected, not all over the world, but in large parts of the world, by the conflict and the troubles here. I had a discussion with one of the members of the, was it here? Can't remember where it was. No, it was last Friday, sorry, at a conference I was at on Friday. And one of the areas that was being talked about was that British soldiers and their families are not involved in any of the processes here. People who lived in the south of Ireland are not involved in the discussions on dealing with the past here. But they're all affected and they're all victims of the troubles. And then their voices need to be heard as well. There needs to be recognition, and recognition means different things to different people. We also have agreed, or we agree on the principle at least, that history should be taught recognizing different perspectives. I often tell the story from this point of view. What I mean by this, actually, sorry, is, and Leslie's already alluded to it, we all have our different perspective from the life that we've lived, and we all see things in different ways. If you see a car accident down the street, depending on where you were standing, you'll see it in a different way. And there's nothing wrong with that. But we just have to be aware of it, and we have to recognise that that is the case. We've talked long and hard about storytelling, and what is storytelling, and what does storytelling mean to people. It bears witness to people's pain and suffering and their experiences. But there also needs to be a generosity in listening. We do a lot of talking, but we don't often listen to what's being said to us. And that, I think, is one of the things that I have learned over this last 12 months. To keep this shut sometimes and listen to what other people are saying. And we also need to remember what actually happened to people. Now, the negative bits. And you can either look at them as negative, or you can say this is an opportunity for us to move this process forward. And that's the way I look at it, and I think that's the way most of the people on the subgroup and on the forum look at it as well. That we have an opportunity where others have failed, maybe, to say, well, how do we do this? How can we move this forward? As has already been mentioned, the definition of a victim is one of the huge areas of contention, and Leslie has outlined this notion of innocence and guilt, and I'm not going to revisit it. But it comes back, as well as Leslie said, to this deserving, undeserving. Who's a victim, who's not a victim. But we do believe that this needs to be moved forward by the First and Deputy First Minister. They should at least open the debate. This is what is being said within the forum. There are other possibilities of definition of a victim. Some say the EU definition would be a way forward. Others have said that it's based on the laws of the land. It talks about the laws of the land. So if the laws of the land are in dispute, well, then the definition is in dispute also. And we have to bear that in mind. Some feel that the definition is not addressed, everything else will fail. Others feel that we have a working definition, and therefore we should work it. But it's an area that we know that we have to address. over the next 12 months probably, or sooner if we get that opportunity. Another area of contention is truth and what is truth. But what we have agreed in relation to this is that those who know it should tell it. Huge difficulty we have probably in this society at the minute is that the vast majority of people who were victims of the conflict were victims from the 1970s, and the people who know that truth are now dying off, and the families are now dying as well. The victims' families are also dying. We believe that it's in everyone's interest that the truth needs to be told. There's discussions around whether that's full disclosure or whether it's that shouldn't say narrative amnesty, it should just say narrative. Whether it's full disclosure, it's individualised, or whether it's a narrative as in this is what we as an organisation did and this is why we did it. But that's again something we need to come back to. There's different ways of going about getting the truth. We've had an amnesty of such, basically in relation to the disappeared, because people can't be prosecuted if they come forward with information that helps to find the bodies of the disappeared. There's been basically amnesties in relation to the Savile inquiry. Leveson doesn't talk about amnesties. That's the Leveson inquiry into press corruption. Is that the right word to use? But Leveson talked about a self-denying ordinance, and I'm not sure if it's a roundabout amnesty, but it's a discussion that needs to be had anyway. So we agree that we have further work to do here, and that further work deals with what is truth and what does truth mean to different people. Another area that we have work to do on is justice and what is justice. And again, justice is a huge word, and as Kathryn mentioned, she talked about Priscilla Hainer and what her discussions in relation to justice, and justice means many things to many people. There's a suggestion that transitional justice mechanisms can be used here. Again, we need to look at that in some more detail. There have been discussions within the forum that said, or in relation to the sentencing of people for the Troubles, that it isn't right that people should be released after 2 years. Again, there's others who say that it had to be the case for us to move forward. We also need to be sure that we don't raise expectations. We have to be realistic about what is on offer. Is it realistic to say that we will have huge numbers of convictions from incidents from the 1970s? No, it's not. We have to be realistic about that. The historical inquiries team have basically worked their way through the 1970s, and there have been 1-2 convictions out of all the cases that they have looked at from the 70s. I think we have to be realistic about that. We have to be realistic for victims, but from a societal point of view as well. There's further work to be done there in relation to understanding what is needed. Narrative of the past, Leslie has already spoken about that, but what it is doing is it's continuing the conflict, I suppose, to a certain extent, and we have to realise that. There are separate and dividing narratives. A narrative needs to be constructed. A narrative needs to be constructed without conflicting narratives being adjudicated. I'm just going to finish off with our conclusions here in relation to the Dealing with the Past subgroup. We realise that the work that we're doing is challenging. It's contentious, but there is an urgency to it. And I think the urgency is that as a society, if we don't start to deal with this, it will come back to bite us at some stage. That's one of them. The other point is that, as I've already mentioned, victims' families and victims and survivors' families are dying, and they're not getting any sense of truth and justice, or even an acknowledgement of what actually happened. There is no alternative. We have to deal with the past. There's been so many different attempts at it. We have to do something about it now. But leadership is needed, but that doesn't necessarily have to be from the top down all the time. We can provide leadership as well. Civic society can provide leadership. We need to grasp that nettle as a society our politicians also need to grasp it as well, and that's hopefully what we'll be saying to them tomorrow as well. But at the back of it all, as we said, the overriding principle is that it should never happen again. Kathryn's just going to finish off now in conclusion. Thank you.
I would just like to acknowledge again the work of our Victims and Survivors Forum. I think you will agree that the knowledge and skills, and most importantly the lived experience, are absolutely vital to support us to understand. So Alan and Leslie, thank you again for your contribution this evening, and also thank you to Violet and to Irene, who are members of our Victims and Survivors Forum and contribute their lived experience as well. So where does this leave us then? What next for the Commission? How do we engage and acknowledge and support victims in Northern Ireland? Well, let me leave you with this. We're about practicality. For example, we're working with the Department for Social Development to ensure those who've been seriously injured suffer no further negative impacts as a result of the changes to benefits. We're working with a group of people who have been seriously injured to bring forward proposals in relation to a civilian pension for that particular group of people. We're about positioning to make sure that victims' needs are met, and we're going to do this through our continued partnership working with the Victims and Survivors Service and with other community and voluntary organisations. We're also about a promise to victims that through the work of the Commission, their voices and their present pain will not be consigned to the past. Do you want to just pause there for a minute? It's one thing to be upstaged by Barack, but not by a 16-year-old. I told you that before I came here that I'd read a piece by a former Victims Commissioner, Sir Kenneth Bloomfield, who described the role as a painful privilege. It is my job, it is my painful privilege to make sure that all victims' voices are heard, and for the rest of society to listen. President Obama in his speech on Monday said, "A bullet need only happen once, but for peace to work, we need to be reminded of its existence again and again and again." And that's what we need from you, that's what we need from every young person in Northern Ireland, and that's what we need from every young person across the world. Now, I talked earlier about Hannah Nelson and her still, quiet voice. And here she is, for 3 minutes, reminding us of the importance of hope.
Good morning. My name is Hannah Nelson. I'm 16 years old and I'm from Belfast. I've been thinking about an important question. How do you make peace permanent in Northern Ireland? Permanent peace in our country is not just a simple dream for me as a teenager growing up today in Northern Ireland. It is a sincere, genuine aspiration. I believe that enduring peace can only come about through true respect for others. We all have a right to express and celebrate our diverse cultures. We all have an obligation to value each other as individuals. As a 16-year-old, I don't want to live in the past. I want to live for the future. I want to live in a country where it is not my religion that is important, but my value as a person which is significant. It is important that we all have a unique identity, a choice in life to choose who and what we want to be. We are growing up in a world where we are taught to be tolerant. To live peacefully, we must put this into practice. We must accept our differences if we are to move forward. I think that my age group should be the focus. We are the ones who must build new relationships with people from different communities. Barriers need to be broken down. If we are to take away prejudice from young people's mind, we can create a society that can get on together, a peaceful society. Northern Ireland is my home, but the reality is, it has a past. Often in Northern Ireland, we hear about our past. People have many genuine stories, and they are definitely what make our history so important. But truthfully, We should not let the past pull us apart and stop us from moving forward. Somehow, we need to make a brighter future, a future that builds bridges and brings people together. We need to work together, not apart. We need to listen to each other, and we need to compromise. Most importantly, we need to clearly value each other. Peace is not easy, and it takes a lot of work to make it happen. I think that it is easy for some to just sit back and hold on to the past. For peace to be an actual reality, however, we all need to take responsibility in the present. Our past, our future. It is all about time. It is in the present time that we really need to be responsible, accountable people and live to make a better future for ourselves. There is no time like the present. Now is the time to start making permanent peace happen in Northern Ireland, because we, the young people in this room, want and deserve to live in peace. Northern Ireland is my home, but the reality is it has a future. Now, please join me in
If I were her
welcoming.
mother, I'd be sobbing with pride for weeks. To conclude, first and last, it is the job of the Commission to give victims and survivors a voice. I got an email recently from a member of our forum, a wonderfully brave, also very quietly spoken woman, who has experienced the most terrible hurt. At the end of the email, she said, "Thank you, my friend, for giving me a voice. Thank you for listening."
Thank you very much. I'm not really sure how to follow that, but thank you very much for all three of you for a really moving, interesting, wide-ranging presentation that I think covered a whole range of issues, from some of the contemporary issues around suffering and the issues that need to be dealt with in relation to victims and their needs, through to some of the very vexing and challenging questions around dealing with the past. So we really appreciate that, and also the work that went into this presentation. So we value that a great deal. Thank you.